Welcome to the channel. This is Ars Poetic and I appreciate you checking out my video review for the Scuf Envision Pro controller. I've spent about 1 month using this controller for PC gaming, and I want to take a deep dive into my thoughts about what this controller offers and why I'm ultimately going to return it. While it does a number of things really well, there's just a couple of critical pieces that fall flat for me personally. In the end, I think there's a lot to like here, but if you have certain expectations or needs from a Pro controller in this price range, you should consider all of the shortcomings I'll mention before buying. Timestamps are in the description in case you want to jump around or skip to what parts you want to hear my opinion on. Now that I've had my Scuf Reflex for just under a year, this will be my main point of reference and comparison when it comes to the Envision. If you're interested in the Scuf Reflex controller at all, be sure to check my review for it. Before we get into the details, there's a quick disclaimer for those that may not know. This is a Windows PC gaming controller. There is no support for macOS and apparently still no compatibility with third-party adapters for other consoles or devices. If that or anything else about the controller makes it a deal breaker for you, I'll have some alternative options for you in the video. Let's start things off by running down a list of features. On paper, this controller offers 11 additional inputs that can be remapped outside of the typical triggers, bumpers, D-pad, and face buttons. In total, that means you've effectively got access to 28 buttons on this thing, which certainly surpasses the typical gamepad. The key part here with the Envision is that those extra inputs don't have to be limited to controller inputs. So if you want to switch things up a bit and bind completely separate functions like keyboard hotkeys or macros, you can totally do that here, which is a pretty rare feature. This could be useful for games packed with functions that don't fit on a standard controller profile. Stuff like MMOs or mouse and keyboard only games like Ready or Not and Escape from Tarkov are good examples of titles that benefit from extra inputs. There are only a couple of controllers on the PC gaming market that allow for such flexibility with the additional inputs themselves, this now being one of them. Before we get into the specifics of the features executed and where some of the negatives really become apparent, let's touch on the ordering process. Initially, only the standard version was readily available for ordering, and I waited for about 2 weeks until the Pro version went on sale again. Early on, there was only one color for the standard and 2 for the Pro. However, now they offer the full color customization options as they do for their other controllers through their build your own option. So you can get creative if you want, but I opted to go for the all black on mine. I placed my order on October 26th, with it shipping out on November 1st and being delivered on the 7th. And so based on that, you can likely expect about 2 weeks from order to delivery. If you do decide to order and then return this controller, there's typically a 30-day return period from date of delivery. There's also a 1-year warranty for any issues you might have. Right out of the box, the first thing you will see is a disclaimer warning you to install the iCUE software before plugging in the controller, so that the appropriate drivers can be installed and firmware updated upon setup. If you've got the Pro model, you'll have an included USB wireless dongle, which you will need in order to use the controller wirelessly, as there is no capability for regular Bluetooth pairing. Also included are button covers for the sax buttons and inner paddles, just in case you'd like to minimize your inputs and instead opt for smoother sides and back on the controller. They'll also throw you one short and one long domed thumbstick cap, in addition to whatever ones you chose for the controller itself. Whether you got the standard or the Pro, you'll get a very nice braided USB A to C cable along with a USB A to C adapter, which is nice if you need to go from a USB C to C connection for your controller, or even use it for another device you have. Now on to the controller itself. The build quality here is excellent. They went for an interesting hybrid design choice here, as it essentially has the Xbox style body with the PlayStation style symmetrical thumbstick layout. Personally, I still prefer the body of the Reflex, which is just that of a DualSense controller, because it's a bit thicker and feels more comfortable in my hands. I also prefer the feel of the Reflex's paddles, whereas the Envision seems to have the same paddle design of the Scuf Instinct, which sit just a touch lower than where I'd like them to be. They have a different shape as well, though I find that I am most comfortable when I place my middle fingers on top of the slants of the inner paddles closest to the middle of the controller, allowing me to place my ring fingers on the lower tips of the outer paddles. You can just opt to use your fingers in the middle of the paddles and click up with the side of your fingers for the inside and down for the outside paddles, but the hand positioning required for that is not ergonomically optimal for me personally. They made an interesting decision to use two different types of clicks for the back paddles, where the outer ones feel like typical back paddles that have more of a chunky click to them, while the inner ones have more of a sharp mouse click feel to them. Despite my preference for the Reflex's ergonomics, the Envision still feels pretty great overall. I just wanted to point those comparisons out for those of you that might be particular about controller layouts and level of comfort. The triggers and bumpers are both hit and miss for me simultaneously. The best thing about the triggers on the Envision Pro is that they have a little toggle on the underside of each one that can be switched on for those instant mechanical triggers. While some controllers out there do have this feature, I feel like the execution here is top of the line. The DualSense Edge is one controller that also offers adjustable trigger stops, but they lack the clicky feedback that you get with the Envision and end up feeling a bit mushy. The Envision instant triggers also have a much shorter travel distance, which feels more appropriate for the feature. So when just comparing the instant triggers alone on these two gamepads, the Envision is certainly the clear winner. On the other hand, not having any adaptive trigger functionality here may be a downside for you, as more games are offering native adaptive trigger support like Cyberpunk 2077, while there are also other ways to utilize those adaptive triggers on PC. The thumbsticks are just like those on the Reflex, which I find to be excellent with their incredibly grippy but not overly abrasive textured sides. As someone who's dabbled with various third-party thumbstick caps and controllers over the years, I still find these to be my preferred sticks. The D-pad and face buttons are super satisfying to use. They are all clicky switches, which in my opinion feel notably better to use as opposed to the typical squishy buttons we get on most other controllers. If you're concerned about the volume, they don't feel excessively loud, though they definitely do emit audible clicks. I'd say they're slightly quieter than regular mouse clicks, but slightly louder and sharper than regular membrane button presses. The sax buttons do have a louder click though, that even sound louder than my mouse. Though these are similarly satisfying to use, while feeling rigid enough to the point where pressing them on accident doesn't seem like it would really be a concern for most players, though I think that does come down to how you grip the controller. You do have the option to disable them or replace them with smooth covers if you'd like. As someone who already loved the sax buttons the first time around on the previous Scuf Vantage controller, these are certainly one of the major highlights for me. Accidental presses did come up in a place I didn't expect though, and that was with the triggers. You'll notice that there is a fairly smooth and unified groove that exists between the bumpers and triggers, while they also sit right up against each other. If you take a look at the DualSense Edge or Reflex, you'll notice a big dip between the bumpers and triggers that can also serve as an anchoring point to rest your fingers on. You can easily press up or down to hit your desired inputs, while maintaining enough separation to mitigate any accidental presses. On the Envision though, the bumpers here have less surface area for your fingers to hit, with no real dip for your fingers to rest on. So it actually becomes easier to press each button individually, while also inherently making it easier to accidentally press the triggers in my experience. I could also see the inverse happening. Don't get me wrong, it's not a constant thing by any means, but I certainly had a handful of situations during intense gameplay where I tensed up and accidentally let a couple shots off because of this. Something that helped me correct this though was adjusting the trigger dead zone in the iCUE software. I noticed that even when you have the instant trigger stops on, the triggers by default actually activate before you even reach the click. I bumped up the trigger dead zone to 10%, and that seems to be the sweet spot for me. So at least there's an option that helps mitigate that issue. In either case, I do think training your muscle memory and getting used to this controller should overcome any potential issues there, so I don't consider it a real problem but still wanted to mention it. The option keys are nothing special. On the Envision, they also sit a little closer to the D-pad and face buttons respectively, which adds to the ease of use. The G keys also have clicky and responsive presses to them. Overall, I welcome the additional inputs, which I think are awesome because we don't really get these many extra buttons on controllers. One thing I will say though, is that I wish that they were about a 1/4 inch higher, which would make them easier to press. I imagine most people will likely use these for extra keybinds or macros that are not used as often in moment-to-moment gameplay, but it does sometimes feel like you gotta stretch those thumbs down there in order to reach them, especially that middle G3 key. The power button and profile button are nothing special. The power one functions as your typical home button, similar to the PS button or Xbox button, whereas the profile button is what you use to switch between controller profiles. You can also hold it down to remap the controller inputs on the fly. So with that detailed overview done, let's talk about the negatives. I think the number one thing that people are going to be disappointed with here is the lack of Hall effect thumbsticks. These have been all the rage lately because of their anti-stick drift properties. If you don't know, regular potentiometer thumbstick modules that we see in almost every standard controller have contacts that can build up natural wear, which can interfere with the controller's ability to accurately translate your analog inputs and emit the appropriate voltage readings into digital signals. Hall effect sensors use magnets to do their magic, which removes one layer of contact for the input and effectively eliminates what is the number one cause of stick drift. So with the increasing cases of stick drift and rising popularity of these HE sticks, I've noticed that many people online don't even want to drop money on a Pro controller anymore if it doesn't have Hall effect sticks, or at least a reasonably easy way to replace the stick modules like how you can on the DualSense Edge. There is a certain amount of calibration you can do with the software and in-game settings, which will mitigate minor drift problems if you have them. In some cases, this may actually be done for you automatically. For example, now that I've had my Scuf Reflex for just about a year, I actually have noticed the development of stick drift and jitter that sometimes causes slight movements to the left and off-center resting positions. The thing is, it's practically undetectable on PS5 because no console game ever really uses 0 dead zone by default. So the existing drift actually typically doesn't exist when I'm playing on my PS5 through regular use. I do a lot of PC gaming with my Reflex these days, and so I've had a couple of situations that have made the drift way more apparent, particularly when using my analog stick to emulate mouse movements and do general things on my PC. Increasing the dead zone can help out with cases like mine where you may only have slight drift, but having drift sucks nonetheless. All that said, recalibrating your sticks in their dead zones through software like I've done are just band-aid solutions that don't fix the real problem here. It also does nothing for more extreme cases of drift, and it may actually hinder your ability to aim if you rely on those lower or non-existent dead zones for precise movements. At this time, the real solution seems to be properly calibrated Hall effect thumbsticks, which unfortunately the Scuf Envision just doesn't offer. If you're open to modding your own controllers, there are ways to install Hall effect modules yourself, or even just replace the potentiometer sensors themselves, but I suggest doing plenty of research before diving into either option. I've glanced over a number of videos and threads online to find that a lot of the replacement Hall effect sticks out there seem to be hit and miss, and also require a bit of calibration. Still, I'm sure there's something out there that works well, or perhaps there will be soon enough. So if you've modded any of your controllers to have Hall effect sticks, or you've replaced the potentiometer modules, I'd love to hear your take in the comments. While that's certainly an investment of time and resources, it seems like a worthy endeavor to help increase the longevity of all these controllers we currently have. One of the biggest disappointments for me in particular is the lack of gyro support, otherwise known as motion controls. I'm sure I'm in the minority here, but I do use motion controls in games that require some level of precise aiming. Even with aim assist on consoles, whenever there is an option to turn on gyro aiming, I typically go for it. However, I usually only do this if there's an option to have the gyro activate while aiming down sights only. There are only a couple of games I know of that have good implementation of this on console, like Call of Duty and Fortnite for example. As long as you have steady hands, gyro can provide you with next level aiming by allowing you to make super quick adjustments to aiming with high precision. My first introduction to gyro aiming was actually on Killzone 2 way back on PS3, and I absolutely loved it there. Not only were you able to fine-tune your sniping with ease, but the actual physical motion of tilting your hands to aim and land headshots with precision just felt very intuitive and added an extra layer of immersion in my opinion. It was a blast back then and I still love it now. While not a true fix for stick drift, gyro functionality can also minimize the need to rely on smaller dead zones for fine analog movements, which is another workaround for dealing with minimal stick drift before you can get it fixed or get a replacement controller. Another bonus to gyro aiming is that recoil can be easily controlled just by tilting your hands ever so slightly. While I still don't think that gyro is popular enough across the board, searching online has shown me that there are plenty of people in the same boat that stand by gyro all the way, and from what I've gathered, that crowd actually seems to be even bigger on PC. This probably has a lot to do with the fact that even if games don't directly support it, you can easily force support through Steam or proper third-party software like reWASD if your controller has the capability. This is why I'm pretty shocked that the Envision doesn't have this feature, considering how it's marketed as a high-end PC gaming controller. I actually created my own PC-specific controller scheme, which acts as an additional layer on top of any reWASD configurations I use. This enables me to switch to a mode that uses the controller as a mouse and short-form keyboard, with plenty of macros, with even the ability to instantly bring up an on-screen keyboard for brief typing needs. This particular layout is another place where I tend to use gyro because the motion control functions a lot more smoothly and closer to a mouse than the analog sticks can, which is great for gaming and non-gaming PC tasks. So that's my extended explanation of why no gyro support just flat out sucks for a premium PC controller. For all the inputs it does have, another drawback is the dead space here in the top center. Based on the design, you might think that it's a touchpad, right? Or at least a trackpad area that you can use to swipe and move your mouse around. Well, sadly, that's not the case here, and it's truly just dead space on a controller. While I don't think it's practical in most games, a touchpad can be super helpful when navigating your PC with a controller, or even using in-game menus that rely on mouse input. The other main benefit to having a clickable touchpad is that when you have the right implementation and software support, you can effectively turn the touchpad into 4 different buttons that have a total of 16 different activation methods for even more options. The touchpad on the Reflex is actually something that I use this very feature for, in specific games like Ready or Not or Escape from Tarkov. I want to start by addressing a comment on my Scuf Envision preview video asking if I could check on compatibility with out-of-the-box Steam inputs without using the iCUE software. Unfortunately, I had some issues getting the controller to work consistently without first updating the firmware through iCUE, and at this time there's no other way to use the additional inputs. Steam only seems to recognize the default Xbox controller layout, meaning you don't have any options to customize the paddles, G keys, or sax buttons on their own without first using the iCUE software. So essentially what you want to do is make sure you have the most up-to-date version of iCUE installed, and you'll need the latest version in order to have it recognize the Scuf and update it correctly. If you have any issues with the setup or general use of the controller, you can try uninstalling the drivers or the Envision itself from Windows Device Manager and starting over. While I had a couple of things I didn't love about this controller, the only other thing that bothers me as much as the lack of gyro and HE support is this terrible fucking iCUE software. It's fairly limited in features, and for whatever reason, this thing only wants to work some of the time. The UI isn't bad, though the experience can feel a bit janky at times since it is a little cumbersome to add multiple custom keybinds back to back. There is a very decent basic set of customizations available for you to start with though. You can adjust the dead zones and response curves for both the sticks and triggers respectively, which did come in handy. You can adjust the vibration intensity and even the lighting effects, which is cool. You can also craft a bunch of different profiles that you can switch between using the profile button, which is great too. The mapping options are good on paper, but this is where I start to see the cracks. There are 2 types of mapping configurations you can craft here. Hardware mappings are the options you have built into the controller, which you can save to the onboard memory and access without iCUE running in the background. This is purely reserved to the 4 back paddles and 2 sax buttons, and your options for mappings only include buttons that are already existing on the controller itself. No macros, no keyboard keys, etc. The G keys have a preset that cannot be changed in this hardware mapping mode, so it is essentially the most basic way you can use the controller. Regular mappings are where things get more interesting and disappointing. There are a number of presets here, but this is where you can take full advantage of the keyboard and mouse inputs, macros, and shortcuts. Heading over to the Custom tab will allow you to start populating a list of custom inputs. You can right-click on any button here to get a list of options. You'll have to choose what type of bind you want to assign, and then a sub-menu will pop up with the appropriate options to select from. Once you have this menu open, you can switch around between options and even disable the button outright if you want to. Alternatively, you can hit the yellow plus to get that sub-menu and choose what your end goal keybind will be, and then choose the button it will be assigned to afterwards. It's just the reverse order of the process. Either method will work, but I found this process to be a bit janky, particularly because you can't see what you've bound to each input at a glance. Instead, you have to click through the lower left menu to figure out what you've mapped. One thing you might notice is that while there are options to set inputs for the left and right analog clicks, you can't adjust the sticks themselves. In other words, you cannot make it so the left stick movement becomes the right stick. The fact that I can't even run a basic lefty configuration with the stick movements is a crazy oversight. Not only that, but there's no option to register the analog sticks as WASD or mouse movements. This basically means there's no using this software for games that don't already have controller support. I've certainly been spoiled with the next level customization reWASD offers, as I've come to rely on those features that are just flat out missing from iCUE. Things like emulating mouse and keyboard movements, I feel should be baked in for a PC-only controller. Another thing that iCUE lacks, which reWASD has, is the ability to create different inputs based on quote-unquote activators. For instance, in Ready or Not, I'll use a single press of the triangle button for number 1, which is my primary weapon. If I double tap triangle, it registers as the number 2, which allows me to switch to my handgun. If I hold down triangle, it registers as caps lock, which is currently my keybind for free look. This enables me to look around while keeping my weapon forward for as long as I hold triangle down. There's also a triple press option I can use, but I don't use that for triangle currently. This effectively means I've currently got 3 separate keybinds with 3 separate functions, all attached to one button on my controller in different ways. There is no such feature in iCUE, which I think is huge for games like this, in which there are simply too many functions for a typical controller. What about those shift layers too, that allow you to essentially have multiple sub-profiles within a single profile, activated by whatever means you decide? For instance, I've got a whole nother controller configuration in action when I hold down L1 for my command menu, and when I let go of L1, it goes back to my primary layout. I'm only scratching the surface here, and ultimately this isn't a video about iCUE versus reWASD, but considering the fact that you have to rely on iCUE to utilize the controller features here, I can't just not compare the two when I've been getting so much more out of reWASD. Features like the ones I just mentioned are incredibly useful for unlocking the full potential of your controller on PC, and iCUE just doesn't have anything beyond the basic remapping, macros, adjustable dead zones, and custom curves. Even if I wanted to keep this controller, iCUE is going to need a ton of support and enhancements for me to really want to ever use it on its own. So basically in my case, I would have to just use both, which I would be fine with if iCUE actually worked for me consistently. I've run various tests, with and without running reWASD simultaneously, and I still get this issue. What seems to happen is that when I turn the controller on initially, I get this bug that either disables the back paddles completely, or if the back paddles work, somehow my triggers are disabled and my G keys are completely reset. All other inputs, even the sax buttons, are fully functional and retain their mapping configuration, but the triggers and the paddles take turns looking at me like, "Tell me what the fuck am I supposed to do?" It seems like it is automatically switching from mapping to hardware mapping, because the G keys are always reset in regular hardware mapping mode. Somehow when it is mapping mode though, the back paddles don't register, and when in hardware mapping mode, the triggers don't work. This isn't tied to a particular game either. When this happens, the issue will carry over from game to game, or even if you close out and reopen the game you're trying to play. I've had this bug across various games, including ones with native controller support and Steam input, so I know it isn't anything related to that. When this particular bug happens, turning off the controller and turning it on doesn't seem to do anything, nor does completely closing out of iCUE or reWASD or any combination of all of that. Even going into wired mode and updating the profiles doesn't do it. The only way I can get the full inputs to work when I've got this bug going on is by completely restarting my computer and trying again. I've scoured various posts on Reddit and I can see that I haven't been the only one with this problem. It all points to an issue with the iCUE software. However, there are also a number of people that say that the controller and the software has worked flawlessly for them, so it ultimately seems like a crapshoot. Hopefully these bugs all get squashed and iCUE gets improved with more features sooner than later. If you are watching this review later on, I recommend Googling around and checking newer reviews or online threads to see if things have improved. As it is right now, this is a major issue that still prevents me from recommending the controller, even if you don't mind all of the other setbacks I mentioned. That summarizes my perspective on the Scuf Envision Pro, which also largely applies to the standard wired version. Ultimately, I really wanted to like this controller, and you can definitely tell from my preview video on it. But it just didn't hit all of the check marks on my list of what makes a great PC gamepad. There's still a lot they did right, and I sincerely applaud them for bringing back the underrated sax buttons. The triggers that can easily switch from super satisfying instant clicks to full analog pulls are dope as well. Even those G keys are pretty damn cool and useful. Despite some of the minor criticisms I had on the design, the Envision still has a pretty good ergonomic feel to it overall that I could see myself getting used to. But there are just those three major flaws that I think keep the Envision from being an easy recommendation as one of the best PC gaming controllers out there. Not shipping with Hall effect thumbsticks is a major miss since there's an increasing number of people who just won't touch a controller that doesn't have them. I think that's going to be the #1 reason people pass on this controller in general. Having to rely on the iCUE software to take full advantage of the main features is terrible, especially when sometimes you're not even able to use the controller appropriately without restarting the PC. While you may not have these experiences at all, the fact is that I've repeatedly had these issues. Not only that, but the software is really shallow in what it actually offers from a customization standpoint, especially when compared side by side to something like reWASD. The software may be fixed up by the time you watch this, so definitely look it up or check the comments and see if people provide any updates. But the lack of gyro is a definite deal breaker for me regardless, because it is insanely useful for those games with no native controller support, which happen to be the ones I've been really into lately. You may not care about the lack of gyro support, but I seriously recommend trying it out for a while if you haven't. The final verdict is that I can't say I'd recommend this controller considering what alternatives we currently have. Don't just take my word for it though. Like I mentioned, check out some other reviews if you're still on the fence. If you can spare that 15% restocking fee, you might just want to bite the bullet and try it out, and simply initiate the return within the window if you don't love it. I feel like it comes down to a couple of questions to consider if you are thinking about purchasing this controller, which may or may not lead you to alternative options based on your answers. Do you prefer a controller that can be used for PC and consoles? Is the PS5 one of those consoles? Would you actually use gyro functionality or adaptive trigger features? Do you want Hall effect thumbsticks for that anti-stick drift goodness? If you answered yes to any of those first three questions, I would generally recommend the Scuf Reflex line of controllers currently. The main caveat with the Reflex is that it is a pain in the ass if you want to use it wirelessly on both PC and PS5. You'll either have to use a USB cable for one, or be okay with repairing it every time you go from one system to the other. I've thought about getting a second one eventually that will be for wireless PC use only, but I will be looking into stick module replacements before I make that decision. If you're on Xbox, the equivalent would be the Scuf Instinct, though the official Elite controller is a good option as well from what I understand. And the paddles on the Elite are mappable as separate inputs on PC. The DualSense Edge is a solid alternative to the Reflex, which has unmatched features on the PS5 directly, and also offers easily replaceable thumbstick modules for any stick drift issues. Not only is the console customization well implemented, but the additional 2 back inputs are separately remappable on PC via reWASD, as well as the 2 function buttons under the sticks, which is dope. The catch with the Edge though is that it only offers those 2 back buttons or paddles, which for me just doesn't cut it. This is why I default to the Reflex. If the DualSense Edge just had another 2 inputs on the back to bring it up what I would consider the standard of 4 back inputs, I would easily pick the Edge over everything right now. That said, the DualSense Edge still remains a very good option for PC and PS5, all things considered. If you want a Pro controller that has Hall effect thumbsticks, 4 back buttons, gyro functionality, toggles for instant clicky triggers, and even separately mappable inputs that can also be used directly in reWASD, I recommend checking out the FlyDigi Vader 3 Pro. This one works on PC, Switch, and Android, so seemingly no Xbox, PlayStation, or Apple devices as far as I've seen. I haven't used any of the FlyDigi controllers myself, but the Vader 3 Pro seems to be the one worth checking out, and is actually much more affordable than the Envision, Reflex, Edge, or any other similar controller at only $90, despite having a similar feature set to the top dogs. This might have to be the next one I pick up and review. There are plenty of other options out there on the market as well though. These are just the ones I feel comfortable recommending based on what I know. If you know of other great alternatives or have thoughts on any of the controllers mentioned in this video, let us know in the comments. So what's next on the channel? Since I've spent so much time crafting and testing my own custom controller configurations for both Ready or Not and Escape from Tarkov, I've published my reWASD configurations for download and will be making a video guide on them. I hope people can build off of those configurations and customize them further if they'd like, or straight up use them as they are. Be on the lookout for those videos if you're interested. As far as hardware reviews go, I'm going to get back to testing out the Retro Fighters, Blade, and Battler GC, so I can do a full review on those. I'll also be receiving the PlayStation accessibility controller soon enough, which I'll definitely be experimenting with. And now that I bounced off the Envision, I'm considering picking up that Vader 3 Pro. Let me know if you got any recommendations on what I should review or check out next. Aside from tech reviews and previews, you can expect the same for various games, as well as a slew of gameplay highlights and clips, with some original music thrown in the mix. If any of that sounds appealing to you, I'd appreciate you subscribing. I've got tons of plans for this channel and I'm excited that we're almost at 100 subscribers. If you don't want to subscribe, that's cool, but I'd still appreciate a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, as it really helps get my video out there. Feel free to pass it on to someone you know that might enjoy or learn something from it. If you feel inclined to dislike the video for any reason, I'd appreciate it if you left your feedback in the comments so I can actually look at what maybe I can improve upon in the future. By the way, I also do stream games on occasion. If you're interested in that sort of thing, or you just want to hang out virtually while I play games that I enjoy, hit me up on Twitch or my other YouTube channel, both linked in the description below. Thanks for kicking it with me on this one. This is Ars Poetic, dropping a mic. Peace.